All right, here we are. My first presentation in Sydney for Adobe. I'm Mark G. I'm actually Australian and spent a lot of time living in Sydney, but I'm based in Wellington, New Zealand at the moment. And I'm a photographer. I'm a astrophotographer. I also work in the film industry where I do visual effects. And I'm also a filmmaker, a time-lapse filmmaker as well. So that's what I'm here to talk about, is time-lapse filmmaking. So what I'm going to do is show you a little bit of what I do, and then I'm going to take you through the process of the equipment I use, and also how I go through and we'll process about three different things, including a day to night time lapse as well. So we'll get stuck into it. I'll just do a quick little show and tell of what I do once I work out these lights. I'm pressing buttons everywhere, but that'll do. All right, there we go. All right, that's about a collection of about 4 or 5 years worth of work. It's probably some of the better stuff, and then there's also some stuff that I've just put in there to go along with it all. So what I do is time lapse. How many of you have shot time lapse before? There's quite a few, which is awesome. It's great. So there's different ways I shoot time lapse. I'm obviously a fan of motion control, as you can see by a lot of those shots. It adds production value to your time lapse, and this is what all this setup is here. You can certainly shoot time lapse just straight locked down on a tripod, and we'll go over a bit of that later on. And it's basically, you just shoot as far as astrophotography is concerned, you just shoot as you would a night sky. So there's nothing different as far as the exposure values and things like that. In a dark sky environment, I'm shooting around an exposure of 35 seconds. I'll shoot an ISO of 6400 and I'll shoot around f4. I like to stop my lens down a little bit just to get rid of some of the artifacting that you get in the corners of your shot. So the interval values, you're probably looking around 30 to 37 seconds. So that's like 7 seconds in between each shot, just to allow the camera long enough to write the cut, to file. And that's pretty much it. There's nothing hard about it. The hardest thing about it is actually thinking in your head what kind of a shot you want and how to compose the shot and how that shot's going to look in motion. And I spend a lot of time doing that. I go out in the daytime and I will actually run through the whole thing and shoot video with motion control to see what the shot's like. And I'll spend hours and hours trying to get that all worked out. And then with these things here, you can, this is a SERP Genie setup. You can program it into the machine and you can come back at night, set up in the same position and away you go. And in fact, I advise doing that because it's an absolute nightmare at night time trying to set up a time lapse in pitch black darkness, with just a head torch. And the amount of time it takes to do that. You need the Milky Way in a certain spot, and if you miss that moment, you've ruined your time lapse. So it's really important. Planning in time lapse is really important, whether you're shooting in the daytime or at night time. So as far as the motion control is concerned, I use the SERP Genie and the SERP products. There's other products out there, but I just find this the best for what I want to do. It's a modular system. On here I have a 3-axis time-lapse setup. I have the linear motion, I have a panning, and I have a tilt. This setup here is all controlled from my phone here. So you can set it up and you can set the panning up and everything like that. You put your tilt and then you work out your linear motion as far as that's concerned. And then it's basically, once it's all set up like that, you just get in there and you can just set it off. It's still locked down here. I'll just restart that. And that'll just start, hopefully, shooting. So as it does a move, shoot, move, and it'll just keep doing that until it completes the time lapse. Obviously, I'm shooting over about 3 minutes here, but a time lapse, I shoot under the night sky. I'll shoot anywhere from 3 hours to, there was a time lapse in that film where I shot 13 hours from sunset to sunrise. And it was all done with this gear here. Now you might have noticed some day to night shots in that video there. I used to do it manually, so I used to control the exposure time manually. I have an app on my phone, and as the daylight is turning to night, you would control that remotely on your phone, and then you'd bring into a program called LR Time-lapse, which we'll be dealing with today, and put it all together, and then that smooths out all the transitions. But the really cool thing now is there's other products out there on the market that will do it automatically, and believe me, it's saved my life. I really get bored of sitting out there watching the exposure and changing it. So this little device here is called a Time-lapse Plus, Time-lapse View Plus. It's fairly new on the market. It was a Kickstarter thing, and for the 13-hour time lapse, I basically put this on the camera, set it up, went to bed, and hope for the best. And it worked flawlessly. It controlled the exposure from the sunset to the right, to the moon, and then the moon set, and then the Milky Way rise, and then sunrise again. And I was just blown away by how well this works. And basically what it does is it evaluates each image, the exposure of each image, and then it will change your exposure based on that. And there's a lot more going on with it, and there's a lot more things you can do with it, like you can even set up pull focus things in here as well. So there's my time lapse, just finished, and it wants to go further than what I set it to. And as the usual, demos never work properly. All right, so any questions? Like I'm going to have questions at the end of the talk because we've got a lot to cover. But yes. How's my battery last? That is a really good question. So as far as this gear here, that's fine. That will go days. I think I've had this going for like 6 days, and it's like a quarter of the battery drained from it. This thing here, it tells you how long the battery will last. It says around 26 hours. I'm not sure how well I trust it because I've never tried it. But the thing is, like when I did the 13-hour time lapse, I was ready to go and change the battery out of my camera and put another battery in. And I had a battery grip, so it had two batteries on it. But what it was doing, it was actually draining the battery of this, because what it does is it writes to this. So for some reason, writing to camera seems to drain a lot of battery. But because it was writing to this, there's heaps of juice in the camera. Yeah, the CF card, it goes in here, SD card, so you can see it here. It just plugs in like that, and then you get the images off that. This is called Time-lapse. Time-lapse Plus is the company, and View is the device. But as far as battery power, like you can get external setups for the different brands of camera and so forth. But at that point in time, I decided I didn't need any more toys, so I was just going to go up there at night time and just change the battery and go that way. But thankfully, I didn't have to. I was quite blown away, actually. So it was great. Any more questions before we move on? We're going to start getting into some processing now. So with processing, my workflow is in Adobe Lightroom. And then I either go through LR Time-lapse, depending on what I'm doing, or I will go into After Effects. And usually I end up finishing off in After Effects. So what I have here is this is another motion control time-lapse which I shot a few years ago of me by a campfire. And it's around 257 frames long. It was probably about a 3-hour time-lapse. But as you can see, it's me by the fire. And a lot of people, me by the bushfire here, it seems. And a lot of people sort of question me because they always wonder how can you expose the fire correctly versus the night sky. Like these are obviously all single exposures. And the tip there is it's not really a big fire. It was just coals. It was just hot coals, and I'm sort of stoking it with a stick. And through these frames here, I've stoked it a little too much, and that's sort of come up like that. But generally, it's little things like that. You just have to work out what works best so you can get the single exposure. And this one turned out pretty well, so I was quite happy with it. So what we'll do is we'll go in and start processing this. So it's more of a bit of an astro processing session at the moment, but we'll get into the tips of that. So what I do is I find a frame that's sort of not too bright, not too dark. It's probably a bit too bright. Probably somewhere like that. We've got a nice little spark going off there. And as you can see at 100%, should be, wow. You can see the noise there on the frame. So we also deal with a lot of noise in astrophotography, but we can deal with that later. We can deal with most of that through Lightroom itself. So with an astro shot, what I do is in the develop module, I neutralize the image first, and by what I'm saying neutralizing, you have white balance, and because we're shooting raw, the white balance obviously isn't baked in. So we can move that white balance wherever we want. But what we're going to do is find a nice neutral balance, and that's where I start my base processing off. I also find the white and black points just to get that all in line, and once I've done that, I get into the more finicky sort of processing side of it to sort of make this image pop a little more. So first up, I'll set the white and black points. So if you hold the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on a PC, and on the black slider here, you'll get this display here. So you can see that by doing that, you're crushing the blacks way too dark, and you can see here in the histogram, that's not what you want. So what you want to do is you want to come up a little bit so you just lose all of that there. So it's pretty much just when you get to a completely white screen. And if you look on the histogram, there's nothing compressing there, nothing crushing it down. So that's pretty good for the blacks. With the whites, it's a little bit of a balance here because I know that this area here of the fire is going to blow out, but we're going to just live with that and sort of base it more off the stars here. So with the whites, it's the same thing. Hold down the Option key, drag it up until you just start to see some stars, and you can just see a couple little blue stars there. and that just brings it up a little more. So if we look at the difference, there's not much difference really. It's just sort of balancing the image out. The other thing that I do sometimes is also with the lens correction. So let's turn that on for this demonstration here. So that's what it would be before and after. And you can see that we've already got some issues here in the corners where the amplification of the high ISO, you're getting purples and things in there, but we can certainly sort that out. So the next thing I want to do is get my white balance neutralized, and I find the best way to do that is just do some crazy vibrance and crazy saturation, so it just looks ridiculous. But it's a good scale to get your white balance right. So right now I can see that this white balance is too blue to be neutral, and if I drag it there, it's too warm, it's too yellow. So it's somewhere in between. It's not there and it's not there, so it's probably about there. So now you go back and you take back your vibrance and your saturation, and you see it's quite a neutral image. You know, it's not quite black and white, but it's a good place to start. So you can swing it wherever you want from there. So now I've done all that, I want to sort of get some detail out of this, and I'm going to touch the evil clarity slider. Now the clarity slider is really great for bringing out detail in the Milky Way and things like that in astrophotography, but some people just do crazy things like that, and you can see that just breaks your image. You start to get haloing around, you know, the contrasty areas, and it's just not a good thing. So just be careful with your clarity slider. Just dial it back a bit. I usually come in around this range here, and we can also do some local adjustments too if we want to punch that Milky Way out a little more. So if we look at what we had before, what we have now, you can see we're starting to punch some stuff out here, right? All right, it's looking pretty good, but now it's looking quite flat. So now we're just going to go back in there and add some contrast and things. So we could probably bring some of those shadows back down a little bit just to help us out. And it's always a good idea to keep an eye on the histogram here. And then we can probably get into some local adjustments here. So this sky here is very flat and quite, you know, monotone. So what I'm going to do is, with my gradient tool, I'm just going to pull that down like that, and we can add some contrast in here. So you get a darker sky at the top leading down to the brighter horizon line. So you can bring that down until it looks relatively okay. And when I process, sometimes I spend way too long processing, and once you do that, you sort of get lost of where you're going. I always have a rule of processing that I usually leave it overnight. So I'll process an image, and then I'll leave it overnight and have a look at it the next day. And most of the time I say, oh my God, why did I do that? And then I'll go back in there and process it again. There's been times when I've processed an image and was so excited about it, I wanted to get it out on social media, that I regretted it the next morning, because you just get a fresh eye once you do walk away from the image. Now this isn't looking too bad. We could probably just go and add some extra clarity in this area anyway. So we can, with our gradients tool, we can just add a little more here. Probably punch a little more contrast in there. So that's not looking too bad at all. This area here, I'll probably get a little more contrast in. So again, with the gradient tool from down here, pull it up through this area. It's almost like doing a vignette, except you're controlling just in the Y values here. So I'll just push a little bit of contrast, maybe take some of those shadows down. And it's not too bad. I'm still not quite happy with it. In fact, I might want to get a little bit of blue back into my white balance here. So it's not very much. It's just a little bit here. Somewhere around there. Looks okay. All right, so between what we had there and what we have now, it's starting to really bring out that Milky Way. You've got a nice balance of the foreground and the sky. Nothing looks too unnatural here. But now what we can do is we can go in here and we can deal with some of these areas here where you can see the amplification here of the high ISO. And I always when I'm processing, do a pass where I just crank the exposure right up, like it just blows your whites out and everything like that. But you can see what's happening in the shadow detail here. You can see that this is an issue over here and this is an issue over here. And sometimes when you're dealing with your own monitor, even though you might have it calibrated and you show it on someone else's monitor, they're going to see these flaws. So it's always good to grade it up a little bit, just when you're fixing the floors, and then take your exposure back to where it was, and then you can go from there. All right, so we'll get into this part here. So I'm just going to get a radial filter, and I'm just going to pull it into here. And what I'll do is I'll just suck some of the saturation out. You don't want to go too far. This will get us some of the way. And what it's doing is it's the inverse. So we want to invert that mask. So there we go here. So you get in the corner there. You can still see a little bit of purple there, but I don't want to suck too much saturation out because I'm going to start affecting that. But what we'll do is we'll suck a little bit of purple out of the whole image as well. And then I can do the same on this side here. Just bring that over right in the corner, the part you just want to affect. We need to invert that as well. And we'll suck a little bit of saturation out there, like so. All right. Now you can still see that there's some issues here as well. Some of the vignetting we might want to add a little bit back in that there. So let's do that first. Go back to the lens correction. And in the manual area of it, you have your vignetting here. So at the moment, this is set to the camera profile. So we're just going to darken a little bit in the corners here, just a touch, just so it's not glowing on the edges. And that's probably about right there. And we've still got it. You can see I've still got the exposure up, and there's still a little bit of purple in here. So we could probably finish that off by going back into our HSL values here, and we can either. I know it's purple, so I don't need to, but I can get that there and find the area, and yes, you can see it's purple. It's affecting it. So just by dragging that down a little bit, that gets rid of that pretty much, and it doesn't affect the rest of the image too bad. Hopefully you don't have too much purple in the image. Cool. So we're in a fairly good place here. I'll take the exposure back. So it's not looking too bad. It's probably where I want to go with as far as the time-lapse is concerned. If I was treating this as an individual image, I might push it a little further. Processing is a very personal thing. You see some Milky Ways processed, and it just looks like a totally another planet kind of thing. But my rule of thumb is this here is the galactic center of our Milky Way. So this is like 27,000 light years away. And it's pretty mind-boggling. It took 27,000 years for that light to get to my camera sensor. And I try not to keep that blown out. I try and keep a little bit of detail in there. And that's sort of my rule of thumb. If I'm blowing that out, then I've gone too far. But you can do all these local adjustments. But the thing is, with time-lapse, any flaws in your processing, you'll definitely see it in the time-lapse, in the moving image. So I'm just going to leave that where it is for now. Oh yes, noise reduction. Fairly simple. I don't do too much noise reduction because it obviously destroys images. So you can, when you're doing noise reduction, zoom into 100%. You can sort of see it in the window here as well. And you can crank it up a little bit. I usually go for the astro stuff around 30 in the luminance value. So you can see the difference there. It's just takes it away a little bit. There's still a little bit of noise, but that's fine. That'll filter out. Another thing is, by default, Lightroom has sharpening set to 25, right? Turn it to 0 when you're doing astro, because what that's doing is it's sharpening your noise beforehand. So you're going to get sharpened noise, and then you're trying to noise reduce. So what you really want is no sharpening and just noise reduce, and that's exactly what we've done there. As far as the color, noise reduction here, and that would sort some of that purple business out down here. So I don't, unless I've got issues, like you can see that there's some mottling. It's very, very subtle. I don't even know if you can see it on that monitor, but it's very subtle on mine. You can just probably crank that a little bit and just add a little bit of smoothness. Don't go too far, because then that will introduce artifacts as well. And that's looking pretty good. So we'll go with that. So that's what we have now. That's what we started with. So I'm pretty happy with that. So what I'm going to do is synchronize that with the rest of the images, because there was no exposure change in these images whatsoever. So we can simply just synchronize it all. So I select all like that, and I want to synchronize everything. I haven't changed anything that I don't want to change. And that will synchronize it all. So you'll see now that all these images are here are processed to what matches that other image. All right, and if we go and check some of the more extreme frames, like this one here, yeah, it's pretty extreme. But the thing is, it's going to be so quick in a time lapse. It's not really going to matter much at all. Yeah, when I first did this, I sort of had a regret because I looked at this and I thought, oh my God, my mother told me 1,000 times. I should have contented, weared it. In fact, I did, and it turned out pretty ugly, so I'm not going to show you that at all. All right, so I've got this. It's all ready to go. I've got all my images. It's pretty simple. Then what I do is I just export it as TIFFs, right? 16-bit TIFFs, because I want to have the control to do any color correction in other post-processing, like if I want to do it in After Effects or I don't usually do it in Premiere because by the time I get to Premiere, I'm dealing with movie files. So any extra processing, I'll either do a batch in Photoshop or I'll just do processing in After Effects. So it's simply an export, and we're just doing a hard drive export. I've already set up my directory to where it's going, and I'm just leaving the naming as it is. You don't need to change your naming unless you want to. And simply to do that, well, you want to have a sequence because you're doing an image sequence, so you need to have the number in there as well. So if I want to go to custom plus sequence, and I just call it guy under stars, and that will save it guy under stars dot -1 right up to 250 odd frames, whatever we got. So my TIFF format, color space, sRGB. We're dealing with video, so RGB monitors, so that we just don't want to go anywhere else with that. I usually go no compression. You can go zip compression. It just makes your files a little smaller, and just takes longer for them to open up and so forth. But I usually go none. And you want it 16-bit. You don't want to go 8-bit. You need all that color information in there just in case you are doing any more color correction. As far as image size, I usually work, unless I'm doing a 4K time lapse or something like that, I usually work to 1920 by 1080, just a regular 1080p HD. But I usually export these a little larger, say 2200 pixels wide. And simply the reason for that is if I want to do a post move or if I need to stabilize things. So you just need a little bit extra on the edge because it'll scale and so forth. And then once that's done, it doesn't matter about metadata or anything like that. You probably don't want to put a watermark on there. So you just hit the export button and away it will go. Now, to save us just waiting around and exporting, I've already exported. So we've gone and done it. So before I move on to the After Effects side of things, questions? Yes?
Those gradients that you're putting on,
Yep.
if you've got a motion control thingy going on,
Yep.
there's horizons shifting, how do you deal with that?
So you could, if you wanted to be really exact, and depending how much your horizon changes. In this one, it doesn't change too much, so I'm pretty safe. But you could use LR Time-lapse, which enables you to keyframe things. So you can keyframe in Lightroom. So you can have all these keyframes where the horizon starts here, and a little further down track it goes down to there, and then you can keyframe your gradient tool to match those horizons. And then LR Time-lapse works out all the in-betweens. That's the best way to deal with that, and we'll be going through that soon. Yes?
When you copy and paste your settings, what's the difference in the software between synchronizing and copy and pasting settings?
I don't think there actually is. Well, I guess what the thing with sync is you get the option. So you get the option of what you want and what you don't want. If you simply copy and paste, you get the same thing. So I don't know I actually don't know. But either way, as long as it copies the same settings, you're good. Any more questions before we move on? Okay, cool. All right, you're all pros. All right. Skip this time. Now we'll start up getting into After Effects. Has everyone used After Effects or no? A few people. Well, that's good. That's good. I find it a really valuable tool to finish off time lapses and sort of just take them the extra mile. And you can do post moves on them and all that sort of thing as well. With this setup here, it's going to be pretty easy. We're just going to basically import the file and run it out. So if I find my Campfire and the Stars, I want to import it as a TIFF sequence. All good. So there it is there. And if we just play through it, you can see that it doesn't look too bad at all. And then you just want to do a composition with it. So at the moment, it comes in by default as 30 frames per second. I usually work in 24 frames per second, which is film, but you don't have to. Like if you're just saving out to video on the web, usually 30 frames per second or 29.97 frames per second. But I use film frame rate 24 because that's what I basically do stuff for. And if you wanted to transcode it to a different frame rate, Premiere, if you take it into Premiere as a movie on a different frame rate, that sorts it out for you without you even having to think about it. But for now, we want to go for 24. So basically, you just hit down here, which is like the interpret footage, and I'm going to assume my frame rate of 24. And there you can see it's changed like that. All right. So we want to just drag it down. So at the moment, I remember we exported at 2200 by 1467. I'm going to drag it down to create a new composition. So that'll create the composition at those settings, right? But I want to change those settings. So it's 1920 by 1080. So I simply go up to composition settings. And because I know the values, I could simply put it in, but then you've got the presets here. So that's it there, HD, TV, 1080, 24. So I'll set that there. It's already knows your duration because you dragged into a new composition, so it's already done for you. Now the issue here is obviously it's too big. So I can change my transform, which is the scale here, and let's just take that down so it just fits in there nicely. I could do a transform across, so if I play this now as it is, it's just going to go what I shot as far as the motion control. If I say, okay, well I want to, like I'm losing a bit of the bottom here, I'm getting a little bit close to the bottom of frame, what I could do is, with my position, I could set a keyframe here at the first frame, and I could say, okay, well I can't really see the Milky Way here yet, let's take it up a little higher. The other way in the y-axis. There we go. So I'll start off about there, and then I'll go right through to my end frame, which is there. And I've got the Milky Way, so I probably want to have the Milky Way more the focus. So then I'll bring that down to there. I'm out of frame here, so it doesn't matter so much about me being gone. And you can see what it does. You're doing a 2D transform. So you've got your motion control, you're just adding an extra layer of complexity to the camera move. And if I play it back like that, now having just seen that, I remember there was an issue with this of the night I shot, and I actually lost. I think the camera didn't fire for one of the frames, and I was devastated because I really liked this this time lapse. So I basically ended up making an in-between frame and putting it into this, which is a little tricky. It's probably more than what we've got time for to do, but you can do things like that and fix your time lapse, your bad time lapse if you needed to. All right, so now I just want to run it out as a movie. So there's two ways I can do it. I can go to the Adobe Media Encoder queue, which has a gazillion file formats for you to run out. But I'm going to add it to the render queue here. And instead of going with the external, and I'm just going to chuck it on my desktop. I should have changed the name of my comp, because that'll give me a better naming, more convincing naming than the 2S5A. So I'll call it again, guy under night sky. And that's good. And I have some presets set here. So ProRes is usually what I work with. It's a good quality compression. There's, unless you got some vignetting or something really bad going on, I usually stick with just ProRes. The file size is a lot smaller, and the difference between ProRes HQ and ProRes isn't that noticeable. So I go for ProRes. And that will run out a movie file, which you can then move into your edit, like with Premiere, and edit from there. So let's just run that out. I lost half my, there we go. So I rendered that out, it won't take very long at all. So there's obviously other ways to compile your time lapses from an image sequence into a movie, but I just like the flexibility I have with After Effects, that I can do. If I need to do a post move, I can. If I have a bad frame, I can create a new frame between. There we go. It's all finished, and then I'll just have a look on the desktop. Here it is, Guy Under the Night Sky. Let's just loop that, and we'll present that full frame, see what it looks like. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much my basic workflow. There's nothing too hard about it. It's basically, it's doing one image, copying all those settings across all the other images, then just outputting a TIFF sequence, image sequence, and then you can bring it into After Effects and do the compile in there and add a 2D move if you really wanted to. And that's basically it for that. Is there any questions before we move on? Yes?
Is there a specific reason you create the TIFF files as opposed to going from your raw files straight to a ProRes file?
Yeah, because sometimes I do a post grade in Photoshop. So it just gives me that extra flexibility. Sometimes I go in and I even use like Google Nick Collection. It's got some good tools in there. It's got some bad tools, but there are some good tools in there. So I'll do a batch process in Photoshop, and it's a grade. So keeping everything in as a TIFF, uncompressed, will just keep that file format right through without any loss in quality. So that's the reason I do that. So, and then I just go straight into After Effects, and then I export everything out of there as ProRes, and then you have your master files to use in Premiere or whatever else you're editing in. All right, so we're all got, yep.
Can you just go through the exporting sequence step again?
Sure, out of Lightroom? Yeah, okay, great. All right, so if we fire up Lightroom again, I've got to go back into Lightroom, so it's all good. All right, so we have our whole sequence here. All right, you select all the images. I did a select all, which is a Command A. Go up to File, and you can export. Brings up your export. Now you have different options here. We're going to export to a hard drive. You choose where you want to put it, and I'm quite happy where that's going there. And I've just done a custom name. You don't need to. You can have just as it is. Yeah, yeah.
It's a conventional export.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah, no problems at all.
Your resolution at 72?
Yeah, 72 DPI, because yeah, we're dealing with screen resolution. We're not worrying about printing the image as such. And the really cool thing of time-lapse, obviously, because you're usually shooting at full res, you can print from one of these images, which I have done in the past. So that's the cool thing. Plus, there's other ways of doing it, interesting stuff with it as well, which I'll cover shortly. All right, any more questions before we move on? All right, cool. So let's get into some night to day to night kind of thing. I'll just kill this at the moment. And I don't need Spotify. Do we need music? I'll kill my After Effects. I'm happy with that. So let's process this one here. So it's the first shot in this little video. So it's a day to night, and I shot it. I cheated. I shot it with this, so I didn't have to worry about changing the exposure. If I did have to change the exposure, once we get into the LR time-lapse, you'll see more of a variation in the actual exposure change, but it all gets smoothed out in the end anyway. So we're going to work on this little sequence here. All right. So has everyone heard of LR time-lapse before? That's good. Not many people have. All right. So LR time-lapse, there was a call for a tool that could give you keyframes when you're basically processing and then work out all the in-betweens, just like animation. And simply because of, we're doing day to night time-lapse. And if you try to do that by manually, there's no way you could do it. Well, you couldn't do it with a good result as what you get with this. So this tool was written by this German guy, and he's quite a smart guy, and he's really good supporting it as well. And it basically plugs right into Lightroom and works with it. It's got a little funny workflow, but once you work it out, it's all good. So what you got to do first is, well, actually, what I'll do first is I'll show you the actual sequence raw. So there's been no processing done whatsoever here, and this is just the raw. And as you can see, the change from night to night, from day to night, is quite smooth, and that's all because of this little tool here. But there is some flickering in it. You also may notice a terrible track, a wobble in there. And what happened this particular day was I had planned it, but I wasn't very good. I was late getting there, so you always get to your location like an hour before. So I really hurried up to try and set up this, and I didn't have any tripods, so I just basically anchored it on rocks, and I didn't sort of anchor it down. And it was quite windy, so you get this little subtle motion. But never fear, After Effects has some great tools that will smooth all that out. So that's what we're going to do. All right, so back into our time lapse. And I just got to find it where it is. It's on my desktop. I thought it was on my desktop. See, that's why it's yeah, here we go. That's why it's a little clunky as far as the file formats, or not the file formats, of the file browsing for files and things. But here it is here, the mail point day to night. So what that's going to do now is going to go through, and it's going to work out the luminosity and the changes in value, and it will go through and create all these values, right? So this will take a little bit. This processing will take a little longer because we're dealing with keyframes and different values and so forth. But you can see it's starting to create the luminosity curve here. And you can already see some up and downs. So the idea of the game by the end of all this is to get this fairly smooth. So you get a nice transition right across the board. Now I'll probably move through this pretty quickly because we're going to run out of time otherwise. But yeah, there's this stuff here. It just takes a little bit to work through. So has anyone attempted a day to night or a night to day before? Yeah, a couple of people. And did you do it manually with the exposure, or no? You just went with it, auto or TV, or you just did it? Made it work. Oh, you forget. Did it work out? Yes. Oh, that's good. That's the main thing. That's awesome. Well, it's good that Not many have done it. It's challenging, but it's definitely worth it when you can pull it off. And they call it you may notice here, the Holy Grail wizard. This is the Holy Grail workflow, because that's what they call it when you do the Holy Grail time lapse from day to night, night to day. All right, so now it's worked out the luminosity, so now we can go through our workflow here. So we want to set some keyframes for this. So by default, it's put around 6 keyframes. I'm going to crank it up to about 8 keyframes here. So that's basically going to set even keyframes throughout this, where we can change our processing across each keyframe, right? The Holy Grail wizard, it's this value here, right? So the idea is, you can't see it, it's not too easy to see if I pop this out like this. Here we go. So the idea is to try and rotate this curve so you get a nice even distribution like right across here. And you kind of do that. It's not the easiest thing to get right. But something like that, you've got your starting value is pretty much there and your ending value goes up a little bit, but everything else is sort of in the middle. But you will smooth all that out in the end. So once we've done that, we save, right? And what that does is it's saving out like sidecar files, little XMLs. And then we jump over into, better open Lightroom. We jump over into Lightroom. I find my time-lapse, which is here, okay? And if we open this up, what will happen is it will hopefully start to recognize that it needs to read metadata from the files because we've changed the metadata. So basically what we'll do is under metadata, read metadata from files, and that's going through and reading the metadata from LR time-lapse, right? So LR time-lapse is setting keyframes, and the way it sets keyframes is it basically rates the image, and you'll see what I mean in a second. Right, so down here in the filters, you can see that you've got these full sequence, keyframes, crop, HD, you don't use most of those. The ones you're interested in, the most of the keyframes in the full sequence. So to start with, we're just dealing with the keyframes. So you can see here, I should have 8, which I do, which is great. And you can see that the light, if I go through each one, it's pretty good because it's a nice change of light. And what we'll do is we'll process each one of these, take it back to LR time-lapse, that'll work out the in-betweens, and then update the metadata again, and then you'll import it all into Lightroom, and away we go. So I'm going to do a really speedy processing here. It's probably going to be really bad processing, but I do have stuff pre-prepared, so it's all good. All right, there we go. So that's pretty good. So now what you do is you've got the first keyframe, second keyframe. You have to use a script up here to synchronize. You don't use that because it breaks what goes back into LR time-lapse. So there's a little script up here called LR time-lapse sync keyframe. Hit that, and then you can have a look between these two. And it's like, yeah, it's not bad. The shadows do get a little darker here, so maybe in this one, we're almost at the point of too far anyway. We'll lift our shadows a little more, so it's quite similar between those two keyframes. So then you get the second keyframe, third keyframe, same process. It's not too bad at all. I don't think I even really need to touch it. So like if we go between these three, it's very similar. So I'm going to leave that one where it is. These two again. And this is where it starts to get a little trickier because you start to get a little darker, obviously. So we can probably just lift the exposure a touch. We wanted to let it get dark, so don't match too close. But that's not too bad there. And then we'll do the same. So it's not too bad between those two. I might just change the white balance a touch, just make it a little warmer still. And the thing is, this works also with your gradient tool, as I was saying before. So if you wanted to get a gradient tool on the horizon here because it's too bright at the moment, you can certainly do that. So I can see between this one there's a bit of a change because it's getting dark. So what I do here, it's getting quite warm, so I'm going to cool it down, a little more neutral. And it's not too bad. I'm basing it off the shadows on the rocks here. You know, as long as it doesn't jump too much between those two, I think we're okay. And then it starts to get interesting when it actually gets dark and you get stars. Again, it's too warm, so my temperature will come down. So it doesn't change the color temperature on this device, but because you're shooting raw, you can change it anyway. So that's the whole point of that. Go a little cooler perhaps, somewhere around there. It's starting to look like nighttime, so I'm not going to do too much more to that. And then again, sync those keyframes. Now that's too bright, so what I can do there is I can take my exposure back down. I want to go a little cooler again. Might just lift the whites a touch, and then I might use my ramp. So what it does is that if you're clicking on the gradient tool here, and you can see that you've got 4, and that's LR Time-lapse adding that in. So don't add more, and you shouldn't need more than 4, but this should be good enough. So I'll just drag this one down here like so, and maybe just add a little bit of contrast there, just to darken the sky down. All right, so we're pretty happy with that. Normally I'd spend a lot longer on it. So then we go back to our library, and you have to put it into the grid mode, otherwise it won't export all the metadata. And now we have these keyframes. We're all happy with the keyframes. We go metadata, save metadata to files. Okay, so that's going to overwrite the metadata that LR Time-lapse wrote out for those particular frames. It's a bit of a back and forth kind of thing, workflow. So now what we do is we go back into LR Time-lapse, we go reload. And what that's doing is reloading all the metadata. And you can see here the keyframes have changed. So they're a lot brighter than what they were. And we go, yep, that's great. Now we want everything in between to auto transition. So what that's doing is working out the transition between those values. So you can see that things are starting to line up a little better. All right, so I can save that. I'm happy with that. So that's just saved out all XMP files again, which is the metadata. So what you can do back in Lightroom, you go full sequence, select all your files, select all, and you can see here that there hasn't been any change yet because I haven't imported, so you can see that's a lot warmer there and that's a lot neutral. But then I go metadata, read metadata from files, and what that's doing is reading all the metadata. And now you can see it's all changing. It's all matching. It's all going to be nice and smooth, right? So we're pretty happy with that. Okay, so now once that's done, you have this thing called visual previews. So we'll start it off because it takes a little bit. So basically what it's doing is it's reading in what it actually looks like in Lightroom, right? So you can visually see what it looks like. And then what we're going to do is do a deflicker. So the software is smart enough to work out, you know, this curve here that tries to line it up on a curve that you set, a smooth curve that you set. And what that does is it gets rid of the flicker. And then you have a really nice sort of transition. Unfortunately, this takes a little bit of time, sort of processing. So what we'll do is wait for this curve to load, see what it looks like. We'll do one visual deflicker, and then I'll go to my cheat because I've already saved out an image sequence. But it's it's a little bit to get your head around because it's back and forth. Yes, questions?
Just to answer that question before, Magic Lantern is what I use.
Right, yes, perfect, yes. Magic Lantern, it's a third-party Canon firmware hack, and it's really handy. And it's worth putting in on your Canon camera, even though it breaks your warranty. It does, I've never had it break my camera. But yeah, there's that, and then there's these devices, which is pretty good as well. So any questions before we keep moving on, while we're waiting this to work its stuff out? Yes?
So where did you export the data from LR Time-lapse so that Lightroom can...
Yeah, so the way it's set out, it's like you've got this top row of things here. So every time you save, it exports an XMP file, right? So that's where the data goes out. This little thing here, drag to Lightroom, because I already had the images in Lightroom, I didn't have to drag this to Lightroom. I don't do that, but you can do it that way as well. Yes?
So are you changing the metadata files on your originals, or do you keep the originals? How does that work?
Yeah, so if we jump into, if I jump into my images, I can find my images somewhere. I'll give you a little bit of a, all right. So we can see here, they're the original CR2 files, the raw files, right? And these are the XMPs, the sidecars. So you can see that each value, so it's, if I just view by name, so you can see IMG 001, IMG 001. So that's the sidecar that goes with that. So all the metadata is within that file, okay? And that's what you're doing. You're writing to that from LR Time-lapse, and then you're writing to that from Lightroom. So that's changes all the time until you get the final file, which is from LR Time-lapse. And that's where all that information is kept.
So you probably just have a backup file.
Well, yeah, the thing is you can blow these away. You can totally delete them or move them to another folder, and you go read from file. That will just reset all your images to the originals. Like it's non-destructive. It's totally non-destructive. It's not actually changing your images as well. It's just doing what it does in Lightroom. Yeah, so you never lose your original image. Yeah, cool. All right, so we can see we've got a bit of a bumpy curve here. We can actually play this back. Not too bad. This is with the processing. We've got our bumps in the road, which we'll fix very shortly. So I'm for what it is, I'm fairly happy with it. So I'm going to do one version of the deflicker, just so you understand what's going on. So visual deflicker, right? So you see this green curve here. That's our target curve. Now you can try and make it as smooth as possible. So that's a lot smoother. So I'll start around 20. And what it does is it tries to get that pink line to match the green line. It won't do it in one go. I'll apply that now. I'll save that now. Apply it. And save, and what it does, you'll see it's putting the dots on the lines and it's trying to apply it to that green line, but you're not going to get it in one go. And that's why you keep going through this visual deflicker process and you keep refining it. So every time it refines it, it gets closer and closer to that green line until you're happy with the result. So I'm just going with it for one time, just for demonstration purposes, but you can get some really smooth results. And this is going to be fairly smooth anyway. You can see already, like before, that was more up and down, but it's getting a lot closer to this green line here. It's quite a challenge. It's quite cool to get it right and a challenge, but it's all worth it in the end. All right, so we're kind of running out of time, so I'll let that run, and I'll say, okay, that's fantastic. I'm going to go over. So the final step is once this is done, once you're happy with it, you hit the save, then you go back into your Lightroom for one more time in your grid view in your library, and you do the same, read metadata from files. Once that's done, you can just export your image sequence as I did before. You file, export as a TIFF, export oversize to allow for stabilization, which I definitely need in this one here. All right, so I'll keep that going, and in the meantime, I'll open up After Effects. All right, so After Effects, I'm going to import the image, the file sequence, which I've already exported out before this. So the outputs and points. Now I did do a grade on this one, so I'll import the grade. I did a grade in Photoshop and batched it. Which, does everyone know how to do batches in Photoshop? It's like a script. I'd love to show you, but we don't have time for that. But you can do that. There's heaps of tutorials out on the web. All right, so let's go in and do our same interpret footage. I want it 24 frames. All right. So if I play this back, this is the actual grade. It's still got those bumps, the bumps in the road, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to actually go in there and stabilize that. So I'm going to create a comp, which is going to be my stabilization comp. So I'm going to leave it as the resolution as it is. So I simply just drop it in on the composition here, and it's called a grade. I'm going to change that name this time. And I'm going to call it mower point day night stab. So I'm stabilizing it, right? Now, After Effects has this amazing plugin, which is great for stabilization now. They've had it for a while, but before it never existed. And it's under the Distort menu, and it's called Warp Stabilizer VFX. So I simply drop it on like that, and then I just wait. And it will work out what's going up and down, and it'll stabilize the image. You lose a little bit of your image, and that's why I said to oversize it, so you do it that way. In the meantime, let's jump back into here, see how this went. So that looks pretty good. There's no real flickering. So we can say, yep, that's good, that's flicker free. I'm happy with that. If you weren't happy and you want to go to the next level, you go to your visual deflicker again, and you hit refine, and it'll go through the whole process again and try and get these little bumps even closer to that line. And you'll keep doing that until you're happy with it. But I don't think we need to do that at all. So yeah, it's all saved out. No, I don't want to save that. Get rid of that. We've got multitasking. It's very hard for a male. So you can see by this little arrow that the metadata has been updated. So I simply just go read metadata from files, which is what LR Time-lapse has just written out with the nice smoothing. And that's what it does, and that's when I do the file export. Meanwhile, back in After Effects, we're still going. We're 55% here, 56% here. So I know I'm going fast and jumping back and forth, but is everyone kind of following what's going on? I've prepared some files. I'm jumping into After Effects. I'm just stabilizing it just to show you how powerful that tool is. Okay, cool. So if anyone's got questions, you've got about 30% before it's finished to ask me. 30 seconds. Yes?
Do you have any preference for camera bodies for this kind of work, especially the low light stuff?
Yeah, I use a Canon 6D, which is great. It's a full frame, and it's mid-range. It's not too pricey. It's half the price of the 5D4, and it does really good at high ISOs. But that's because I'm a Canon guy. I've invested a lot of money in Canon lenses, so I stick with that. Sony, great. the new Sonys are really good, except they have what they call Star Eater. So basically what that is in their software, they try and do some in-camera hot pixel reduction. Instead of killing just the hot pixels, they also kill the stars, which is pretty useless. So they're trying to come up with a fix like that. Nikon, another brand, they've got great cameras, just as good. So you can take your pick from the mid-range full frames across the board, the different brands. You can't go wrong these days. They're all good. But yeah, my choice is a Canon 6D. Yes?
What sort of resources do you use for research in terms of setting up the composition or where the Milky Way is going to
Yep.
be and so on?
Sure. Apps are your friend, right? I have an app called Photo Pills, and it's a great app. I'll just show you really quickly. That's it there. Photo Pills. Spanish crazy guys live on an island off Spain. I went there a few months ago, and they're crazy. But you have a planner, and like in the centre of Sydney, it's going to be hard to get a shot of the Milky Way. But you can actually scroll through, and this is the Milky. It's hard to see here, but this is the Milky Way here, and you can see it rotating around. And this line out here is the galactic center of the Milky Way. It's like the Swiss Army knife of photography, astrophotography. It's got time-lapse calculations, Milky Way, sunrise, moonset, and it keeps going on and on. There's another one called Planet, which is very similar. TPE is another one. There's a host of them. Yes. Yeah, TPE. Yeah. Yeah. So there's about 3 main players in that area, and it's got VR, night VR as well. So in this room, if I look around there, there. If I'm looking up there, and that's where the Milky Way is right now. And you can go to a location, move it in time, see where it is, and away you go. All right. So I think we're stabilized. Let's see. So far, so good. Warp stabilizer is the VFX warp stabilizer is the best thing ever that's happened to time-lapse. It's just so good. It's not only time-lapse, it's for lots of things. But yeah, before that, it was hard to fix something like this. So I also know that because I've done some grading on this, I've probably pushed a little too far, so I've got some extra noise. So I'll actually do noise reduction within After Effects as well. I have a plugin for that, which I'll tell you which one it is after this, and it's really good. But it's a noise reduction plugin for video, and it's great. Yes?
Is there a reason why you use After Effects over Premiere?
Yeah, there is, because Premiere image sequences, you can't deal with image sequences, and you can't do the post-production that you can do in After Effects. Like you can warp stabilizers definitely in Premiere as well, so you can do that. But you're dealing with movie files, so at least with this way, I can keep the image file as a TIFF and 16-bit TIFF, so I can do the color grading and everything like that instead of using movie files within Premiere. It's just a sort of a step in between, so I can keep everything highest quality before I start editing. Yeah. All right, so you can see by this that's improved dramatically as far as the warping. Before it was like all up and down, but Warp Stabilizer's done a really great job. So by dragging through like that, you can see that's pretty good. Yeah, so I talked about image noise. There's a plugin called Neat Video Reduce Noise. And I'll just take you through it really quickly because we're running out of time. And you can do an auto profile. No, I don't want it automatically. I want to do it manually. All right. So there's my manual auto profile. And then I just go to noise filters. And if I make this a bit larger so we can see what's going on. Like that's way too far, but there's settings you can go in there and you can mix that back, or you can simply apply it and put it as another layer in After Effects. So you can quickly do this. Okay, so I've copied that. Going too far. There we go. You just want to. All right. So if I delete that effect, reduce noise there, and I just keep it on this one here, or you could have it as an adjustment layer. Either way, it works. And I just change the opacity a little bit, so I can mix it in, so I can keep some of that detail. So there you go. It's and if you wanted to, you can set up masks and all sorts of things in here, and just have it apply to, say, the water, and keep the detail on the rocks. All right, so that's the day to night. That's that process at all. I'll keep moving. We've got about 20 minutes. I've got one more thing to show you, and then we can just have questions, and then you can ask me outside as well if you want. It's good to see no one's left the room yet, so we must be going okay. All right. So I have this, with astrophotography, I shoot the night sky, obviously. I mostly shoot stars, but I also like shooting the moon as well. So I have this big 600mm lens, which is great for shooting the moon. But it's also really good for keeping an eye on your neighbors that are about they're about 2 kilometers away. So I did this time lapse the other night. I won't show you that bit just yet. All right. So I thought I came along. I thought, wouldn't this be cool to see if we can do like a neighborhood watch video? So this is what I shot the other night. No, that's the end result. You don't want to see that. See, I can't even find it now. See, it's all broken. But basically, let's go back to After Effects. We'll do it in there. So I basically shot a full big time lapse, locked off. There's no it's no motion, but you can see it's a time lapse of my neighbours 2 kilometres away. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if we could do a little, like a neighbourhood watch thing, and zoom into their houses and see if they're okay in that house, and then zoom out again and go into another house and just make sure everyone's doing all right. So that's what I've done. And it's just demonstrating that, even though you've shot a boring old locked off time lapse, it doesn't mean you have to stay with that. You can make it dynamic if you wanted to. So I'll quickly just go through the process to start off again. All right. So my neighborhood watch, the frame size is 5,760 wide. It's a full frame, shot with a Canon 5D Mark III. So you have heaps of resolution there, especially if we're going to shoot it, if we're going to work in 1920 HD, which we're going to do. So I've pulled it into a composition. I'm going to change that to my 1080, which is 1920 by 1080. And that way you can see that you have a nice close-up view of your neighbour's house. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to do a bit of zooming in and out to make it a little more dynamic. All right, so I'll scale it right down. So we're out wide. Let's make it 33.5 to make it a little more precise. And I'll pull that up there like that. Okay, so that's really cool. You can play it like that and watch the lights going off and people move around. But if we want to get a little bit closer, let's set some keyframes. So I'll move the timeline along a little bit. And I'm just going to be dealing with the position and the scale of this time lapse here. So to get just those two values up, I'll hit the S key for scale, I'll hold the shift key down and hit the P. So now I've got position and scale, and that's all I'm going to deal with. And I'm going to set a keyframe right there for both of those, right? So I'll move a couple more frames over, and I'm going to scale up to 100%. So I'm zooming right in to this guy's house here. All right, so I'm happy watching that house for a little bit, see what's going on. Someone turns the light on, what's going on beyond the bedroom there. I'm going to get in trouble for this, aren't I? Especially when they put it online and my neighbour recognises their house. Then I set another keyframe. Okay? And then we're going to zoom back out to where we originally were. So just move it along another couple of frames, and instead of setting keyframes, you can simply copy and paste. If you click on that and then hold down the Shift key, you can copy that and then paste that back into place. So now what's essentially happening is you're zoomed out like that, zooms in like that. There's your neighbour's house, watch the interesting stuff. Then it zooms out again like that, right? So that's pretty cool. So we'll go with that, and let's do another one. Quickly put some keyframes in place there. We've got the keyframes. Let's zoom back in 100%. Right, let's go and find another place that's more interesting. We've been to that house. Right, that's pretty good there. Let's watch that place for a little bit, see what goes on. And again, we set keyframes. And then we just copy these keyframes again. Let's copy those. Move over a few more places. Paste it in. So you can see what's going on. I'm moving in and out like this. So it just makes it a little more dynamic, all right? Now the cool things about After Effects, like I could go around to all these houses. In fact, I prepared this already. I've had a good look at the houses, so I know what's going on. But the cool thing about After Effects is when you do 2D moves, you can also turn on motion blur. So you get that sort of crash zoom in and then pull out. But even though you can't see it here, once you render it out, you can see the motion blur. So to save time and to allow us a little time for questions afterwards, I'll turn on motion blur here in the timeline. So this little thing here means it simulates shadow motion blur, right? You have a fair bit of control over that in the advanced settings, but we won't go into that. We're just going to go with what it is, and we can see what happens. So this is the file. I've done exactly the same thing. So I've zoomed in here, had a good look. Zoomed in here, had a look what's going on. Back out. No, I'm at the same house. That's confusing. I must like that house. Must have been something interesting going on there. And then I'm back in there again, do another one. A little bit of a post move, floating post move. Back out, back in. So you get the idea. And what you end up with is, once it's rendered, with the motion blur on, I'll just open this one up here, and I'll loop that. So you can see from just that boring old locked off camera stabilized shot, we've got a bit of a dynamic movement around, and that was pretty quick to do in After Effects. And the motion blur is really great. It's a really great transition that you've got to work with. It just adds a little bit of extra interest into it. And I use a lot of that. Like, I don't normally use this all the time. Sometimes I'll just go out, set my camera up on the tripod, just lock it off, and then I'll put little 2D post moves just to keep the some interest moving. It just adds production value to all your time-lapse videos. Always have the camera moving. Working in the film industry, I do feature films, so I work with directors, and they always want the camera moving, except for one or two maybe. They like to lock it off, which makes it easier for us. But most of them, directors always want that camera moving to tell the story. So don't be afraid to experiment and do crazy things like this. You can borrow my 600mm lens if you want, and see what you come up with. But that's pretty much me. Is there any questions before we go? We've got 10 minutes, so we've got a little bit of time. Yes?
How do you deal with condensation?
Aha! Everyone asked that question, and that's a really good question. So condensation on the lens, when you're shooting time-lapse, I have a really good story about that. I was at a place in New Zealand called Cape Palliser, and it's a lighthouse, which you probably saw in there. And I had this time-lapse going. It was awesome. The stars were there, and the Milky Way was rotating around. And I was keeping an eye on it, and I started to notice that it was starting to get a little bit foggy. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? And I looked around in front of the lens, and I started seeing condensation coming on the lens. So the dew point had dropped, and you start to get condensation on the glass. And I didn't want to stop this time-lapse. I've only just gotten into it. I had another 3 hours to go. So what I did was got out. I'll tell you exactly the tool I got out. Couldn't do it without it. I bring it with me everywhere. So I got out this, and between each shot, I do that. And I did that for 3 hours. I got the time lapse. It was awesome. But I had a sore arm the next day. So I thought after that I'm going to do some research, how the hell do I stop that condensation? And the answer, there's a couple of do-it-yourself ways. Some people use hand warmers from, go to Kathmandu or Outdoor Supply, get hand warmers and wrap them around, Velcro them around your lens, or they put them in a sock. But the thing with that is they only last 40 minutes maximum. But luckily people have invented lens warmers. So it's like a little sleeping bag for your lens. I haven't got one here today, but it basically, a bit of Velcro wraps around, it's got an element in it, and it heats up. And you connect that to a power source. And that will keep your lens dew-free all night long. For hours and hours and hours. So yes, definitely get one if you suffer from that. Okay, thank you very much for coming.